Welcome back to another episode of Fly That Law. I'm your host, Benjamin Ho, and here today with us once again is Professor Andrew Harding of the National University of Singapore, an esteemed constitutional scholar, and excitingly here with us today too, Associate Professor Dr. Dian Shah, Deputy Director of the Centre for Asian Legal Studies and the co-convener of the Law and Religion research cluster. She's highly interested and have written much in the field of religion and law, which will be our topic today. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, without further ado, let's dive into today's topic. Malaysia is a country of rich history with multiple parties with different interests coming together to form this federation of ours. And while our founding father has expressly stated that this country is secular in nature, is Malaysia now an Islamic state?
We're back to the most fundamental question that animates this discussion: is Malaysia an Islamic state? Well, if you ask me, in my opinion, I don't think so, and I don't think Malaysia is an Islamic state for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, I don't think the term or the adjective Islamic can be applied to a political institution, which is the state. It describes a person or a people, but not a political institution. And Andrew and I, we've had some chats on this. Second, if an Islamic state is supposed to be a state that implements Sharia in a very comprehensive and systemic manner, and we're not just talking about Islamic laws, but Sharia is a comprehensive normative system, a way of life that is more than just hard and fast rules, so if we take that definition, and I'd like to think that that is the definition of an Islamic state where we see some a reasonable consensus among scholars, then I don't think Malaysia fits that characterization. But then I'll throw the question back to you. What is an Islamic state? I'm not a theologian, so I can't answer that question, but it has been defined in various ways. Some people or scholars think that an Islamic state is an Islamic state because Muslims are the majority. Some scholars are of the view that an Islamic state is an Islamic state because Sharia is a or the formal source of law. Or implements Islamic law in some ways in the constitution, or makes a declaration that Islam is the official state religion, and therefore that makes that state or that country an Islamic state. But then that stops at the formal level, right? It stops at, it's a form, but not substance. So who determines, would it be the ruling elites who determines if Malaysia is or isn't an Islamic state? By what criteria do we judge this? There's a whole lot of questions.
A question with more questions.
Yes, exactly.
Now, let's phrase it in an opposite manner. Is Malaysia, as Tunku Abdul Rahman once declared, a secular state? Because a lot of people would disagree with that notion with the passing of, for example, Article 1211A of the Constitution. They have asserted that where the civil courts have no jurisdiction over certain areas of law, even if they do have certain review powers, as declared now in the recent rulings, the other cases that we have gotten from the then Chief Justice now, is Malaysia now a secular state, or in its substance still combines
somewhere in between, a hybrid, a mixed? Again, it's open to interpretation and how you look at these things. Some people say, or some scholars assert that, well, because we do implement some aspects of Islamic law in the country, therefore we cannot say that we're a fully secular state. Whereas you look at other scholars and they will say that, well, just because you implement in some ways religious law, it does not mean that you are not a secular state. A secular state, even that term, has so many meanings, and so many forms. You really have to dig deep to be able to give meaning to these sorts of labels. Personally, I don't think labels help, but for me, if you push me to a corner and ask me, I will say that Malaysia is a secular state. We're run by secular institutions. In fact, the Islamic laws that are enacted and enforced in this country are enacted by secular institutions. They're enacted by the federal parliament in the case of the federal territories, or in the case of the state individual states, they're enacted by the state assemblies, and these are secular institutions.
Can I just make an observation here on the point about applying Sharia to Muslims? Because there are actually many countries, especially in this region, that do that couldn't possibly be described as Islamic states. I mean, Singapore is one example.
Absolutely.
The Philippines, Thailand, Myanmar, Indonesia might be more similar to Malaysia in this respect. But those countries clearly are not by any standard Islamic states, and yet they have this system of legal pluralism where they apply Islamic law to Muslim populations in the area of personal law, which is the same as what Malaysia does. So that really cannot be a criteria, certainly not a conclusive criteria.
I agree with you, Andrew. It's not a conclusive criteria. Just building on what Andrew said about Singapore. Singapore has the Administration of Muslim Law Act, which applies some aspects of Islamic personal law to Muslims to govern their matters of marriage, divorce, inheritance, so on and so forth. Right? So does that, if by some definition or some people or some scholars' definition, that the fact that we have some Islamic law applicable in the country that makes a country an Islamic state, then is Singapore an Islamic state as well, because they enforce this Administration of Muslim Law Act for their Muslim residents?
I think that's a worthy question to ask, especially in the context of, for example, like Southeast Asia and South Asia as a whole, where we do have a lot of countries with legal pluralism who incorporates religion into their constitution. Sri Lanka, Indonesia, all of these have some sort of religious elements inside of their country, and we wouldn't call all out that they are indeed an Islamic state or
a Christian state for that matter.
Yes, the Philippines, I think. Philippines have a strict separation of church and state.
Yes, but they're majority Catholic. So do we call them a Catholic state? No, we don't. Right?
Is there a parallel actually with England here? Because in England, as opposed to Scotland, we have an established church, the Church of England. The Scotland has the Church of Scotland. So in a way, they both have an established official religion, and it's not purely formal, because remember that officially the king is the head of the Anglican Church, and the crown gets to appoint the Archbishop of Canterbury and so on. So there isn't really a separation.
I agree.
But nobody really describes England as being a religious state. So
not anymore.
So I mean, is there a kind of a medium situation where you have an official religion, but you don't describe the state as somehow being coloured or defined by that religion? And if so, would that be a parallel situation, do you think, to Malaysia or not?
Well, it's interesting that you brought up that example, Andrew, because as I was researching on this issue, as you know, I wrote a book on it, looking through the constitutional history and the constitutional making documents, the debates when this particular provision was being discussed, Islam as the religion of the Federation. In fact, in the notes, it was recognized that the idea here is to almost replicate the arrangement in England, where you have the Church of England as the state religion, so to speak, but that doesn't affect the rights of others, particularly minorities, or the rights guaranteed to the citizens in general. So it was explicitly noted that this was to be modeled after England.
And that therefore there would be no issues with regard to, for example, religious minorities or freedom of religion. But let me add an interesting kind of footnote to this, which is that you recall Sir Ivor Jennings was one of the members of the Reid Commission, and it was well known that Jennings was what they called a disestablishmentarian. In other words, he wanted to, to disestablish the Church of England in England, and that seemed to have sort of coloured his view. So he was apparently against having what we now see as Article 3 in the Constitution. But the other members of the Commission insisted on having it.
Yes.
But on the basis that did not affect the adherents of other religions.
Right. I completely agree with you. In fact, and I'm just paraphrasing here, I think, again, in the notes, Sir Ivor Jennings mentioned that Islam does not need state protection. So that is one significant one. And then also, when the alliance headed by Tunku at the time, they were negotiating, right, with a number of parties on how do we formulate this and how do we put this into the Constitution? Is there a necessity at all to have this in the Constitution? And towards the end of that discussion, the alliance, through Tunku, said that, we need to have this because... but at the end of the day, it's symbolic. It's symbolically significant. This is why we have it there. And at that point in time, it would have been important psychologically for the Malay Muslim community at that time. So these were the two things that were explicitly mentioned in the documents.
Yes, indeed. And I recall some years ago that R.H. Hickling, who was advising the government of the Federation of Malaya and the Tunku at the time, was asked by the Tunku to go and check out the position with Islamic states across the world and report back on how they had dealt with some of the issues like freedom of religion that we're discussing. And basically, I mean, you did have some examples like the Islamic State of Pakistan, for example, and I mean, now there's Iran and I think Afghanistan, which perhaps were not Islamic states at the time, but there were still a number of them. And the conclusion was basically the Tunku said there is no problem with this. I mean, even if you define it as an Islamic state, still does not affect the rights of minorities. And so he was confident to assure non-Muslims that their rights would not be affected by this. But there's another aspect of this which you sort of hinted on just now. That, I mean, my understanding is that the Malay rulers were against putting Article 3 in the Constitution for the obvious reasons that I mean, Islam was under their control at the state level, and they feared that by making Islam the religion of the federation, that would somehow take away their powers as heads of Islam at the state level. Do you have any kind of comment on this rather odd situation where you have an official religion, but also the religion is a state matter?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I mean I alluded to the fact that there was this process of bargaining and negotiation between the alliance and many different stakeholders, if you could put it that way. And one of those stakeholders were the Malay rulers, the sultans. They were explicitly against the idea of having Islam as the religion of the federation, that formulation, precisely for the reasons that you mentioned. And then in the end, they agreed to including this provision into the Constitution because the Tunku assured them that the provision establishing Islam as the religion of the Federation would not affect the powers of the individual sultans in their respective states. And that was the assurance that they needed. And in addition to that, I think this is where we're getting into the question that you posed just now, or where we're heading into with respect to religion and state relations at kind of in a different conceptual box. In addition to that, the Tunku also said that if there were to be an institution, a state institution set up for religion, it would be for coordination purposes, interstate coordination purposes only. Again, this is I'm not saying anything controversial here because this is all historical documents and people can dig this up.
Right. So it was clear then at the time, if I'm right, and I think Joseph Fernando in his work bears this out, referring to the very documentation you're talking about. The clear understanding was that Article 3 was, how should we put this, non-consequential in terms of both states' rights and individual religious rights and the rights of religious communities. Is that fair?
Yes, that's
statement?
a fair conclusion. And I think people often forget that this particular all these debates and assurances, they're formalized somewhat in the Constitution. And with respect to the relationship between Article 3 and other provisions in the Constitution, there is a specific sub-provision. Article 3.4 says that nothing in this provision shall derogate from other provisions in the Constitution. I think this is probably the most overlooked provision in our Constitution when we discuss religion-state relations.
Indeed.
So beyond that discussion of the form of the Constitution for the religion of the state, do you think in Malaysia, where we have now a more formalized institution of how the states govern Islam, that Malaysia still has the freedom of religion that we set out to have?
Well, this is the classic question of divergence between theory and practice, or between what's guaranteed in paper and what happens in practice. There are challenges to freedom of religion in Malaysia, I believe, for both Muslims and non-Muslims alike, but the provisions are there in the Constitution. We're guaranteed the freedom of religion, and if we feel that in some ways our freedom of religion is challenged or restricted, then there's a possibility of asserting them through the appropriate channels.
It's the case that Muslims have less religious freedoms compared with the adherents of other religion, or other adherents of religion who then enter into the Islamic religion.
This is also an interesting question. Let me try to think about how to formulate my thinking here. So one thing we know is that there are formal Islamic bodies and institutions in Malaysia that enforces laws and standards or norms of Islamic life for the Muslim community. And to that extent, if we believe that freedom of religion means that it's the freedom of the individual Muslim to think about and practice his or her faith as he or she sees fit, to have opinions about the religion, then one could make an argument that maybe there is a restriction there, because now we have to conform to what the established state institutions have decided to be the appropriate a version of Islam to be practiced in this country, and anything outside of the state-sanctioned version of Islam would not be appropriate.
Then is this model quite similar to the one that is practiced in England? Because if we look at England, actually, even though it's currently established-ish because of how secular the government appears to be, there is still, for example, clerical insertion in the House of Lords, where there are spiritual lords from the Church of England, and also that church canon laws or church laws in England must be regulated by Parliament. So anything that affects the practice of religion in the Church of England is regulated by Parliament, and so under, in a certain sense, also secular control. Is this something similar that we can see be paralleled in England, here in Malaysia?
It sounds similar. I mean, the way that you've described it, I don't know it to the very little details that you have mentioned, and maybe there's more detail to that. And Andrew, you might want to weigh in on this, but just by that description alone, it sounds similar, but I think that the level of institutionalization of Islam in Malaysia is not at that level in England. Here, it's very heavily, Islam is very heavily regulated by the state, the doctrines, the what is acceptable practice and whatnot, what words you can use and you cannot use. These are all heavily regulated. But I don't think, as far as I know, that in England, for the adherents of the Church of England, that it is that kind of, or that extent of regulation. What do you think, Andrew?
No, I think your assumption there is absolutely right. I mean, historically, yes, I mean, there was a close relationship between the state and the Anglican Church. But I mean, for almost all purposes, the Anglican Church just operates as a kind of a separate bureaucratic structure. It's not bureaucratized by the state. Whereas I think we know there's a whole literature around the bureaucratization of Islam in Malaysia. So I think that's an important difference. I mean, there is a lot of bureaucracy in the Anglican Church, but I don't think there's really any occasion or motive or even essentially power for the government to interfere with that process. So, for example, even though formally speaking, the Crown appoints the Archbishop of Canterbury, I mean, basically, it's stitched up by the church so that the king doesn't have any choice really as to who to appoint, because they make it clear who their preferred person is, and so the king obviously doesn't want to interfere with that because it would cause problems. So the outcome is actually it's closer towards a separation of church and state than it is identity of the two, joining of the two together.
It just brings me to this case from the late 1980s, since we're talking about freedom of religion and whether Muslims have less freedom of religion. Just this case came to my mind. Muhammad bin Daud, I think you remember this case, Andrew. Yeah. There are actually 3 or 4 people in this case. They had delivered a religious sermon, had given the call for Friday prayers. I think, if I remember correctly, it was the state of Terengganu. I'm pretty sure about that. And some other things. And they were charged or sanctioned in some way for not having obtained state permission, if you could call it that, to deliver the sermon, to give the call to prayer. And that's very basic in terms of a Muslim's practice. So even if that is circumscribed, that you need to have some permission, then that gives a clear answer to your question as to the extent of freedom of religion that Muslims may or may not have
and of course, none
in
of
the
that
country.
applies to the other religions, right?
That's right.
Which are left completely to run themselves in the way that they like. But the other aspect that we haven't mentioned here maybe is I mean, freedom of religion in terms of a decision to join or not to join a particular religion. And obviously there are obstacles. If somebody wants to leave Islam, it becomes an apostasy issue. And then you get these sort of difficulties. Whereas if you wanted to convert from Hinduism to Christianity, for example, then you would have no obstacle at all. So in that sense, I mean, the question is right, isn't it? That Muslims actually have less freedom of religion. Some people outside the country might be surprised by that, because they would think of Islam as kind of being superior and therefore kind of punching down on other religions. But that's not really the reality.
No. Before we get into the question of apostasy and change of religion, I'd just like to ask a bit more about that statement that you just made, which is, I'm curious about this. Is the state the overarching control, having overarching control over the religion, or is the state giving permission for the religious authorities to make and exercise authority over the adherents? Because I think there's a minute difference here that may not be exactly important in some sense, but definitely in terms of analyzing it, in terms of empirically understanding it, makes a lot of difference, because then you would have an understanding where the secular institutions institute the formulation for a religious or a spiritual side of the practice or personal law regarding the person adhering to the Muslim religion.
I think the short response to that is that the religious bureaucracy, the policy makers, the Majlis Agama Islam at state level, or the Jabatan Agama Islam at all state levels, they are part of the state apparatus, right? So, in a way, as you have to seek approval through these bureaucracies, effectively, you need to seek approval from the state, because these bureaucracies are part of the states. They are civil servants of the state, effectively.
Yeah.
So in a sense, civil servants, in a sense, the religious authorities is part and parcel of the government.
Absolutely.
So they have
the state government.
The state's government. In a sense, they are established in the government itself.
They're part of the apparatus of the government, yes, of the executive.
It seems much rather that it's quite similar to, well, not exactly in terms of substance, but in form, appears to parallel England, which is that you have an institution run by the state, people hired from the state, people hired by the state in a religious institution controlled by the state. Does that make sense? I'm so sorry.
I guess to the extent that these authorities are hired, administered, if you will, funded by the state, then yes, there's some parallels there. But I think perhaps the difference that we have in mind here is the effect, the kind of trickle-down effect to the masses, if you will, in terms of the powers and the reach of the authorities, if you're comparing England and Malaysia.
Sorry, back to you, Professor Harding.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, as I was saying before, I think this has changed over the years. And I mean, let's say in the Middle Ages, I mean, the king would sort of use the authority of the Archbishop of Canterbury or whoever it was, to sort of regulate the population. But nowadays, I mean, there is no equivalent to this, the Malaysian bureaucracy that you have at the state level, which is supposed to enforce Islamic principles on the Muslim population, to secure the correct interpretation, to license people to give sermons, and that sort of thing. All of that is in England is within the purview of the church itself, and the government literally does not have any office for religion. I mean, there is no minister or any official that is supposed to deal with
a minister
relations
for religious
between
affairs. I don't think.
Yes, exactly. not even just for the Anglican Church, let alone for religion more generally. So, I mean, insofar as the government engages with this, it's purely a matter, I suppose, of public order. So, yes, there will be people in the Home Office or, say, in the security services who kind of know what's going on with various religions, but not from the point of view of controlling ideology or behavior, except if that behavior becomes serious in terms of, say, radicalization, and there's quite a bit of this kind of going on at the moment, as you probably know, or in threats to public order. That would be where it would kick in.
Well, as we've alluded to earlier, the question of whether Malaysia is an Islamic state or a secular state started essentially from the point of the amendment introduced by Article 121A. We see that in that amendment there is an ouster clause in essentially ousting the civil court's jurisdiction from matters of the Sharia court.
In certain areas.
In certain areas, yes. And so with the drafting being an ouster clause, why do you think there are still so many conflicts after so many years? I think it's been like 30 something odd years that there's still so many conflicts over what essentially is the Sharia court's jurisdiction.
I think one site for conflict that we've seen is that where you have an issue that could be seen as being properly within the jurisdiction of the Sharia court, but at the same time also implicates questions of secular, quote unquote, questions of fundamental rights and constitutional interpretation, which is properly within the jurisdiction of the civil courts. I think these are the sites that have sort of given rise to these sorts of conflict. And perhaps I don't know if we can say that 121(1)(a) could have been drafted better, maybe not. I'm not sure. I couldn't think about a better formulation myself, at least at this point in time. But yeah, that is the primary site of conflict, really, when you have this so-called overlapping jurisdictions. Otherwise, it doesn't present much of an issue, right? I mean,
but in Indira Gandhi, the court has made it clear that orders of the civil court have priority over orders of the Sharia court. So that if there is a conflict between a decision of the Sharia court and the fundamental right the citizen, the party has under the constitution, that the latter would prevail.
Right.
And if that's right, that seems to indicate that the state cannot be an Islamic state, because it would be surely the other way around if the state were formally Islamic. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And in Indira Gandhi, the court did say explicitly that just because the person making the decision was a religious authority, it did not mean that the jurisdiction of the civil court to oversee or to not to control, to check on the decisions of that authority is completely extinguished by Article 121A. That's not the effect of that provision. And if that is so, again, going back to the first question, if we believe that an Islamic state is a state that applies Sharia normative systems of norms and rules in a comprehensive and systematic manner, then a case could be made that this judgment doesn't cohere with that idea of an Islamic state. But again, we go back to the question of when people invoke the term and use the term and say this or that, what do they mean by it? Do they have a clear articulation or idea of what is an Islamic state? How would it work down to the little details? Who would determine what is Islamic or non-Islamic? I mean, a simple example would be the Islamic Republic of Iran. Okay, it calls itself an Islamic state, but I don't think that Saudi Arabia, this is mentioned in one article I read a long time ago. Saudi Arabia, which is also an Islamic state, recognizes Iran as an Islamic state because they come from completely different worldviews of Islam, if you will. Then again, the question, by what criteria do we call a state to be Islamic?
I suppose this question in our zeitgeist is much more cultural than a legal question, in the sense that I think there are certain elements where it invokes a certain sense of pride, in a certain sense of the authority that the religion of the state carries emotionally. And I think going back,
as I said, that was what was recognized, the psychological effect of having Islam as a religion of the Federation for the Malay Muslims.
Yeah. So I think that question being rather answered. I have one other question. I think this might be a bit more out there. In your latest article, I think the latest I can find, Dismantling Democratic Change in Asia, Modalities and Weapons of Choice, you talked about the fact that actually constitutional amendments are no longer quote unquote a weapon of choice for dismantling democracy. I'd like to understand, like, in terms of other changes made to institutionalize, well, I'm not talking about democracy here, so like in terms of like institutionalizing the religion here, are there any other sort of usage that outside of, for example, Article 121A, which is, constitutional change, are there any other sort of alternative ways that the state have tried to bring in the state more, the religion more into the state?
I think simplest would be day-to-day policy making.
Could you
I don't have a list off the top of my head, but just in terms of, for instance, you could think of curriculum in education, right? What's the balance between, for the sake of argument, I'm just going to say the secular subjects. I don't think they're really secular, but there you go, since we're using these terms, and the so-called the Islamic education part of it.
Religious schools.
So those sorts of things. But then again, we've had
for people to go on the Hajj, perhaps,
right? Yeah.
There's official support in terms of, actual money to facilitate people going to Mecca.
Yes, although I feel that that's probably inevitable because it's a Muslim majority country, and because the state regulates the religion that much, then it has to facilitate as well people going for Hajj. But even things like, or something just escaped my mind actually that I wanted to bring up, but it's okay, it'll come back to me.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, like, I think in the modern age here, where the federal parliament actually is no longer controlled by a party with 2/3 majority, there are a lot more decisions that are being made from day to day that helps to institutionalize the position of Islam, to help provide for, in a sense, the position of Islam to be more institutionalized in Malaysia. And I think in certain sense that wouldn't be wrong. I think in Sarawak there is also provision of funds for other religions. So there is definitely a involvement for the state to regulate or to support the activities of different religions.
So let me just come back to you and ask that question. When you say that more and more Islam in policy making or in the decisions of the state. Some people don't like this word, but let's just use it for the sake of argument. Islamization. Okay? What do you mean what do you have in mind exactly when you posed that question?
I think what I had in mind is understanding whether, in terms of the decision making for the state institutions, for example, in terms of making the budget, in terms of understanding how political authority is settled here in Malaysia, are we actually utilizing firstly, the constitution, or secondly, understanding this as a combination of both? For example, I think there exists in certain minds, for example, that the constitution goes alongside Islam as one of the tenets that the country should be run on. So I think in terms of understanding where authority stems from, most secular institutions would say, for example, the constitution is definitely the one and only source for a democratic country that has a written constitution, as is the case in Malaysia. But there are certain arguments to be had where the constitution recognizes Islam as the religion of the federation. Is there a role to be played in terms of where political authority should rest upon? Yeah.
I ask you that question because I think the question stemmed from this article that you read, where the argument is that nowadays autocrats or anti-democrats dismantle democracies not through constitutional amendments, but through other political practices, day-to-day decisions, policy-making decisions involving the state. And therefore, I think the conversation went into what sorts of decisions that were being made to, in a way, inject more Islam into governance in Malaysia. The thing that initially escaped my mind was this: if so we attach a lot of these Islamic labels to a lot of things, right? Okay, Islamic education, Islamic schools, religious schools, and whatnot. Again, a lot of these are forms. But if the government has a policy or pursues multiple policies driving Islamic values into governance, and those values include good governance, anti-corruption. Those are also Islamic values, I would say.
Yep.
Then where does this conversation lead to, right? How do we then repackage this conversation about the Islamic State, what the government should and shouldn't do? To what extent should the government Islamize the country or not Islamize the country? If the government is serious about Islamizing the country, for instance, then fight corruption right to its core. I'm all for that. We would all be for that, right? So again, you know, what are we talking about here? I mean, not in this podcast, but as the society debates this thing on Islam or no Islam, more Islam or less Islam.
I think in terms of the morals of the Islamic religion, there are definitely good points, like you said, in terms of anti-corruption. That's definitely one thing that we want to see more in Malaysia, not less.
And
there's famous story actually about an Egyptian scholar in the late 19th century who visited London and then went back to Egypt, and they asked him, how was it? And he said, well, I have seen Islam, but there were no Muslims. And I come back to Egypt and I see Muslims, but there is no Islam. So I think he's making the point that there is this kind of moral aspect to it, and you know, people who are not Muslims could actually comply with what Islam sees as a good thing, and that might kind of impact on this Islamic State idea. And you know, what is the source of law in your society? I mean, you said earlier on, I mean, there's a question, you know, is Islam a or the source of law? Might be a very interesting distinction. Obviously, it is a source of law in Malaysia, as it is in many other countries. But is it the source of law? Are other sources of law allowed? It seems to me that generally that they are allowed, provided they are consistent with Islamic principles, which you know, they might be because they're anti-corruption laws, as you as you point out. This sort of brings me to another question I have, which is, I mean, going back to our earlier discussion about what is an Islamic state, to me, one of the really important markers would be whether there is an institution that checks that the laws are consistent with Islam. Now, importantly, Malaysia does not have such a mechanism.
Right.
All right, there may be scholars who maybe point out that some provision is un-Islamic, but that's not the same as having an actual institution, which Iran has, for example.
Right.
I think Pakistan has as well, to check the Islamic credentials of any other law that there might be.
Yeah. So there's a formal institution and a formal procedure for that.
Yes, so that it can act as in Iran, the Council of Guardians acts as a sort of constitutional court to say, well, you can't pass this measure because it would be contrary to Islam. But my point is that Malaysia doesn't have anything resembling such an institution. So, I mean, does that disqualify Malaysia as an Islamic state? Because I mean, how can you be sure that that the law that is consistent with Islam if there's no means of checking that question?
Right. I agree with you on that point. But even if we had such institutions, then it goes back to, I think, a question that I alluded to earlier. Who decides the personnel of that institution? If you see what I mean, who decides who gets to decide?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Then it becomes more complicated, doesn't it? Because you're down right to the little details that people don't think about when they throw the word Islamic State into the conversation.
Yeah.
If we were to have a council of muftis. Who decides?
Well, 1,000 controversies would bloom over a question
by
like
what
that.
criteria? What are the basic qualifications do they need to have? Are we going to elect them, or is another body going to appoint them?
We have to set up another committee to appoint the people on the committee that make those decisions, and then who decides who's going to be on the selection committee. So it's a sort of an infinite.
Who's going to do the filtering process?
Exactly.
Then coming back to, in terms of Islam and the law, does it actually, in a certain sense, affect how politics is carried out here in Malaysia? In the sense that do we see that there are certain measures passed, for example, that they were characterized as, for example, an Islamic law, but in fact is actually just a secular piece of law?
Islamic law, but in fact just a secular piece of law.
Like a piece of law that is not defined. That's defined as, in a sense, I think what I'm trying to say is basically, do we have political authority, even though resting upon secular institutions, carried out by secular institutions, saying that this is to safeguard Islam, or this involves Islam in a certain sense, but actually in reality, I think it's more of a political mechanism to entrench their powers in a sense.
So you're saying that these decisions at the end of the day are driven by political dynamics and political expediency, as opposed to genuine concerns about whether or not, or to the extent to which the values, morals and norms and principles of Islam should be practiced.
Said, anti-corruption and so many of the other virtuous morals that I think me and Professor Harding can agree on so much have not exactly been seen here in Malaysia.
Yeah, so we definitely, I mean, this is again not nothing novel or original I'm saying here, that but there is a huge enough consensus we're seeing that Islam is part of the political arsenal of many several political parties, and it's part of the toolkit, right? It's part of the rhetoric. And if we want to think about that more concretely in terms of laws, we could look into what is called, and I've written about this, religious penal clauses in the penal code itself. There are certain provisions, if I'm not mistaken, it's section 295, 290, all those provisions that were included there, that were contested in that case of Muhammad bin Daud, the case that I mentioned earlier about the person who was giving a sermon and giving the call to prayers. They were charged under those penal clauses. Now, how did those provisions come about? Were they inserted into the penal code? That was by way of a amendment. And if you trace again the Hansard, there was a political motive behind the inclusion of this provision into the penal code, and true enough, in a way, subsequently used against people who were doing something religious or exercising their religious practice, but it seemed that the motivation behind that was political. The persecution or prosecution of these people were political.
Yes, because if I remember, the provision was couched in general terms.
Yes, it didn't mention any religion.
An act to create hostility among members of any religion. So it could, in theory, apply to any religion. But it seemed as though it was pretty clear that it was aimed at Islamic dissent, if we could call it.
That's right. That's right. And from kind of the East Coast, where at that time, right, that was the main political rival of the then ruling party, and it was we were in a certain era. I mean, I was not in that era at that time. Maybe I can't remember. Was I born yet at that time? Maybe just barely a few years old, maybe. But we were in a particular era, right, where there was a clampdown on political opposition, including religious political parties.
But I mean, almost sort of very soon after that, there was the emergence of these Islamic criminal laws in Kelantan and Terengganu, which raised the question that we flagged earlier about Islam being a state power. And of course, the Muhammad Daud case, you have a problem because you're dealing with amendments to the penal code, and the penal code being a federal, federal general criminal law being a federal matter, and Islam being a state matter. But that, of course, has been explored further in the more recent Nick Ellen case, where the federal court struck down a large number of criminal provisions at the state level on the basis that the state did not have the power to pass those laws because it trespassed on the federal control over criminal law. And I think the interesting point was made in this case that the legislative list, the federal and state lists, define what the powers of the respective legislatures are, and you cannot, for example, enact a law in a particular area merely because, let's say, the federal parliament has not chosen to exercise its legislative power in that area. It would still be constitutionally invalid, even though you're occupying a vacated space, as it were. So it's a pretty striking decision to I think they struck down 16 criminal laws on that occasion.
Yeah, I think so. Going back, I think to answer the first ever question that we posed here, I think there is still definitely a precedence of the constitution over any sort of other more symbolic powers here that we have institutionalized in Article 4. So I think with that, we can certainly answer that Malaysia is not really an Islamic state, but with definitely Islamic characteristics that I think at certain times we do quite value it. For example, I think there are a lot of virtuous values that we do benefit from, in terms of religion, in terms of understanding of morality being institutionalized. For example, if we do utilize it correctly, I think there is a huge potential for it to do much good for Malaysia in this current zeitgeist. So I think with that, if both of you have no other comments to add, I think we'll end it here.
We can talk all day about this.
So what
it's such a heavy topic and much talked about. But as I think we've kind of chit chat amongst us earlier offline, I think there's a serious need to rethink the questions we're asking in Malaysia about religion-state relations. We cannot be asking the same questions over and over again. And for the sake of, going forward, developing religious harmony and religious tolerance in the society, and at least minimizing the impact of the politicization of religion, I think we have to ask better questions amongst ourselves with respect to this relationship between Islam or religion and the state.
Indeed.
I think religion is definitely a very personal issue for most people. I think personally, I think I'm a devout Christian, but I think there are definitely values that I would see as being of a state nature and something of a moral nature, more personal to ourselves. And so I think how we negotiate that between citizens and how we live that out is much more important than sometimes the larger political arrangements that we have.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Very good.
All
yes.
right. Okay. I think that would be all. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. Thanks very much.
For joining. Thank you.
Thanks.